Still in 12. It's the never-ending 21 verses. We're at verse 16, I think, or so. Yeah, as I said last week, this one took me by surprise. Partly from what other people say. I mean, I didn't have that much to say. I have, including the text, I have 6 pages in my notes, but chapter 8 is like 16 pages or something like that. But this has taken just as long as chapter 8 did. So that's all on you. Anyway, this is the chapter that starts out with one of the most famous admonitions, exhortations in the Bible. I urge you, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And you would expect him then to go on and be like a good American who thinks in English with a bunch of definitions for what all these terms mean. He does not do that. He simply tells you what it looks like with further admonitions, further exhortations, one after another. I think I counted 26. So he gets right into it, 26 starting in verse 9. So he gets right into it with this problem of thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think. You should recognize that from, for example, Philippians, is it chapter 2? Regard the other as more important than yourself. Getting at the same thing, same kind of thing. And I think we tend to think of this, we tend to abstract this idea of arrogance or conceit. In fact, with that word, it does it right there. Here, with do not think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, you have in mind another person that you think of as lesser than you. There's an inverse side to this. So it's very much a corporate idea of the manifestation of the problem of what we call arrogance. When we talk about it, we tend to think of it in the abstract. As we're going about our business, don't be arrogant or something like that. It's not exactly what he's doing here, I don't think. I think he's, as I've said, he's getting into this status sense that these people were permeated with. That that the world was divided up into a social caste system. And you found yourself in that caste, and you found the people around you in their caste, and only then can you know how to relate to them. Which doesn't mean you're mean to them, but you have to establish some kind of social pecking order right off the bat. And I think that was very natural for these people. They were born with it, practically. And so even in the church, in your meetings, in your assemblies, in the Lord's table and so forth, same exact thing, especially at a table. And we have as the paradigm of that, of course, the Last Supper, which is, again, an inversion of the social status system, where the head of the table, Jesus, in John, I think it is, washes their feet. It's a shocking display of the overturning of social status for these people. And so that's the idea here, I think, behind this high-mindedness. It's a cancer in the church. It's a cancer in life in general. But in the church, we just can't have it. And they were permeated with that sort of thing. We tend to be a little different. If a homeless person walks to the door right now, there'd be 4 people that would jump up and escort him to the table and sit with him and so forth. It's not the same thing. Not that we're more virtuous than they are. We are not. But it's not the way our problems manifest necessarily. But for them, it certainly was. And so that's the direction he goes, and he gets on with let love be without hypocrisy, practice genuine love. In Greek, it's 2 words, love without hypocrisy. Where it's only 2 words. But that's all it is, not even a verb in the sentence. And then it kind of stands over the rest of this section from 9 to the end of the chapter in 21. 26, I think there's 26 in this section. We finished off at end of 15, beginning of 16, where we return once again to this idea of the mind, how one is to think. We started with it in verse 2. We present our bodies in chapter 1 and verse 1, and then in verse 2, we are transformed by the renewing of our mind. So he's got this body and mind thing going. The body before, remember, being under the control of sin, chapter 7, which we have now been freed from, chapter 8. And now it is to be reconformed, so to speak, from the pattern of Adam, as before, to the pattern of Christ. And that requires the Spirit, whom he doesn't actually mention here, but he does in other places. We won't get into that right now. At any rate, this world is the world of Adam. And it is as natural to us as it was to the first century Hellenistic Gentiles of Paul's day. No Jew would have had a problem with this. Do not be conformed to this world. They would have understood that. The Gentiles is a different story. That's where their value set came from. We live in a world that has a value set. And that value set is dynamic. It's changing all the time. Anyone, I'm not playing the old guy here, but over the course of the decades, you can see the value set. If you, let's say, go back to, well, the 20s are bad because that's pretty loose, but let's go with, the 40s and 50s. It's almost like a cyclical thing, the roaring 20s, a lot of vice and so forth. Then it resets. I'm thinking out loud here. You have prohibition, the reining of it in or something like that. World War II, and, adversity always tends to make for a more conservative morality for a people that can last a while, which it did. So that's the 40s and 50s, 60s comes along, and here we go. And so the value set then begins to change and loosen up. And it has continued to evolve from that origin, in my view, thinking out loud still, the postmodernist origin of, postmodern morality, moral framework that just exploded onto the scene in the 60s. It had its hints in the 50s, but in the 60s, and now the repercussions of that. And so now we're in this ever-evolving time of ever-evolving value sets where you can hardly keep up with it year after year as the values of the world around us change. And you can watch people change their values with it. My favorite in that regard is to pay attention to the ever-changing lawn signs. They just keep moving with the times. And so it's, as somebody I listen to sometimes calls it's the morality of the current year. It's current year morality. That's the world that we live in. And next year's morality will be different from this year's morality. And if you don't notice it and pay attention to it, you might very easily be subsumed into it. It's right now most obviously manifesting in regard to, for example, the LGBT movement, which is firmly in control of the value set of the world in almost a religious sense, to the point where we have a month dedicated to it and its reinforcement in the cultural mindset. June is now officially the month to reinforce the world's value set and require some sort of allegiance during that time. But against that, they had their own problems. We have this now. They would not have understood that necessarily. We do not understand this. But now we have to somehow take this and understand it in the context of our own times. But right off the bat, those statements at the top are very much transferable as they are. And the rest of it is too, right? It is absolutely true. Do not think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. But he gets going here, and they're very, very general for a reason. They apply, it's the application chapter, only in this case, the application applies at all times. So a lot of these are very very general. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. And what is evil never changes. But very often what was considered evil is now accepted by the culture as good. So suddenly what you abhorred as evil before, and the world abhorred as evil, now you abhor as evil, but the world clings to as good. And they demand that you do the same thing, requiring a change to your moral framework, your moral compass, which we're not supposed to do. And so this, I think, deals in, over time, this deals in, that's where this becomes a real problem for the modern Christian. I just talked for I don't know how many minutes, though none of that was planned. So if anybody wants to interrupt and say something about, it's all very, very provocative, what I just said. I think it's also true, but
It says, let love be without hypocrisy. I guess, would it be true to say that love with hypocrisy wouldn't really even be?
it's a contradiction in terms. And it really depends on the word hypocrisy there. Because in the English mind, hypocrisy would mean I say that I love something or someone, but I really don't. And I'm telling everybody else to love something or someone, but I really don't. He's not exactly, that's all true, but he's not exactly saying that. He's saying practice sincere, genuine love from the heart. He's saying something like that. There's no pretense. There's no public persona to it. It's not a projection of what you want the world to see. It's an expression of the inner person, where Christ is, where the Holy Spirit indwells, and then it flows out from that source. I think he's getting at something like that. And then he gives some examples of that. It's all sort of inner church language and application. Be devoted to one another. Well, he's clearly talking about the church here. He's not talking about the world out there. I mean, right? I mean, the idea here is you and I have an inter-church relationship and understanding that requires a reciprocity or something like that. And that's what he's getting at. And he uses that term, which we talked about last week, brotherly love, which only seems to have application within the church. You know, the song, We Are the World, everyone is, the idea that everyone is your brother. There's a Star Trek episode like that, where they recreate the origin of the Christian movement. Tell me if you remember this one. They recreate the origin of the Christian movement on a planet that is basically the Roman Empire. And there's this budding new movement of they call them the sun people of the sun. But all through the show, you think they're talking about SUN, sun worshipers. And at the end of the show, you find out that no, it's SON. Uhura points out that they're all wrong. It's the Son of God, not the sun up in the sky. That's the movement. But in the show, it's a brotherly love. The secret had been kept from them that all people are brothers. That's what the religion was reduced down to in this show. That's the best the world can do with that sort of thing. The
word abhor, thinking in order to abhor what is evil, we also have to recognize what's evil, because I think it's easy to become insensitive or hardened and not even.
It's maybe even harder than that, because the world is going to reinforce your evil as its good. And so the world is telling you everywhere you go that what you think of as evil is what they think of as good. And if it starts at 5 years old, or whenever you get to public school, that just becomes very natural. Very, very difficult situation. Back in those days, he didn't have to define these terms, because they all had the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Hebrew Bible, and they had their sort of Jewish moral sense or something like that. These terms were not all that, they didn't sit around debating probably what he meant by evil. We have to, because we're in a fight with the world over the very definition of the very idea of what constitutes evil, because their idea of evil is not defined by what God defines as evil.
Abhor is a really strong word.
It is.
I don't know how good a job I do of abhorring, trying to avoid.
It almost has an emotional element to it, doesn't it? Abhor, hate. You could use that word. In fact, it probably translates in other translations. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Why do I remember that? What verse is that?
Cling can be a strong word too.
Hate. Yeah. Hate has an emotional content to it. It's not a word of indifference. It's not emotionally indifferent. It's not a pure act of the will. It's got an emotional element to it. But
perhaps the more we abhor what's evil, the better job we'll do of recognizing.
Recognizing it, yeah, but you have to stay in the word because the world is, man, the world doesn't tolerate you getting off the reservation. When you go up on social media and say the wrong thing take the wrong position on the wrong thing, oh boy. Hound you day and night. We live in a time when a moral license underpins the world's moral framework. Constraint is not a part of the world's moral framework anymore. License, it's about license, liberty, freedom. If you wait long enough, eventually, if you wait long enough, there'll be a bad war. And then the next generation that grows up out of that war will be more conservative or comes out of that war. That's how there was a lot of talk about whether Generation Z was going to be the most conservative generation in a long, long time as a reaction against their parents and grandparents, the boomers, Gen X and the boomers, and then the silence as a reaction against it. And whether COVID was going to encourage that more conservative approach to morality. You have to wait. I don't know. You look quizzical right now, probably because you're going, but no, it takes adversity. You got to have a bad thing.
It's like saying about God, he hates sin, but he loves the sinner. And I think he's trying to encourage us that as Christians, as children of God, we're supposed to hate evil as much as God hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't say hate the person.
But we're supposed to, love those that sin, because we're all sinners. And so we need to make sure that we don't, it's kind of, I'll use an example. I worked with a guy that was a homosexual. But he knew I didn't love his
Practice.
Sin or the lifestyle that he lived. I didn't treat him any different than I did anybody else that I worked with. I tried to show him love just as much, but he knew that I didn't like that. I knew that homosexuality was a sin. It's not something that God planned him to do. It's his choice, and I think that's what he's trying to say here. We need to make sure that the sins of this world is not part of our lives, and that we hate it. And it's just like, 1 John 2 talks about 15 to 16, so don't love the world, things of the world, pride of life and the lust of it and so forth. And so basically that's what he's trying to say here. We're as Christians, we should desire to sin, but we also we shouldn't appreciate anybody else's sins. We should to abstain, we're supposed to not desire to sin. And we're not supposed to love it when other people do it either. So that doesn't change the fact that we're supposed to love those people.
Yeah, Jesus manifested this routinely in the Gospels. So we don't even really need to guess at how it looks or what's behind it, how to manifest it. We just have to read the Gospels and see how he did it, what he did. But then again, a lot of times like with prostitute, if we assume that the woman who showed up at the dinner with Simon, the Pharisee, when he was at Simon's house, we assume that she was a prostitute. You can see how closely related the evil that they would perceive her as practicing also reflected her social status. They were directly related, and he kind of overturned two things there at one time, one of which was the social status, social caste system, and the other was he embraces her, so to speak, or he lets her touch him, even though from the vantage point of both God and man, those men, she was practicing evil. And so you just see it right there in full bloom.
Like the woman caught in adultery. You know, they brought her, they bring the man that she'd been sleeping with, you know, they let him go, and then they brought her to Jesus, and he said, okay, the first person that hasn't sinned, you cast the first stone at her. They all laughed. And she's, going to accuse you of. And they all laughed, and she said, well, I don't accuse you either. Even though he was letting them know, he didn't, the doctor was sin, but I know what was sin, I know what you. And,
I think that's a very, if I remember right, that's a very powerful scene in the movie Jesus of Nazareth that was made in the 70s. I recommend the whole thing, but it's a very powerful scene. Okay. Let's go. Verse 16. We just came through, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. That should sound familiar. That's right out of the mouth of Jesus. He doesn't even bother to say it. Rejoice with those who rejoice. This is almost, verse 15 is almost like a lead-in to verse 16. He gives the example of it before he states the principle. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Normally it would be the other way around. Be of the same mind toward one another. For example, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The closest possible identification with your fellow believers, I guess. Do not be haughty in mind. There it is again. But associate with the lowly. I think I talked about that last week. I think I said something about he comes in the door, you go get him. You don't wait for him to go sit down at the low part of the table. Low status part, you go get him and bring him up. Do not be wise in your own estimation. There it is again. Haughtiness. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, sort of closes out, something that he started in verse 9, he seems to close out here with the return to the idea of evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And of course, you don't overcome evil with revenge, settling a score or something like that. You overcome it with good. But he doesn't bother defining it other than to say you don't pay back evil for evil. Getting very close to the Jesus statement in Matthew, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, reciprocity, the principle of retaliation, so to speak. And Jesus overturned that, established kind of a principle of non-retaliation in some sense in his ministry. Although that sounds too much like a general principle, I tend to steer clear of that, except in rare occasions. But here he seems to be getting at exactly the same idea, which would be very difficult for people in Rome to accept. These are citizens of the Roman Empire. I mean, you didn't let an evil go. Rome was not an empire that was inclined to let what it considered a wrong, an offense to it, go by. It just didn't do it. I mean, what do we call it? The hard feelings that the Romans had towards the Gauls, this is modern day France, was centuries old. And so when Caesar in the 60s or so BC, before the Roman Republic was established under Caesar Augustus, he just went to establish his name. He just went and attacked Gaul, Gaul, wrote about it too. I forget the name of it. We still have it. His diary of his incursions into Gaul. But man, he slaughtered a lot of people. The Romans had no problem with that. They were historic. They remember everything. They right the wrong, so to speak. That's how they conquered Gaul, with this unprovoked attack by Caesar. The Gaulish Wars was the name of the book. Now that I think it's in my head and I can't get rid of it. But That's how they were, that's how they operated. There was the, in 9 BC, 9 AD, during the time of Jesus, when he would have been but a youth, the Teutonics, I forget what they're called, what they called the barbarians in the north on the other side of, I think, the Danube, maybe, the German tribes, Germanic tribes, ambushed the Roman legion. The Roman legions were over there. There's like 4 of them. They ambushed the Roman legions and slaughtered every last one of them. That's settling a score. The Romans hadn't attacked. I don't think the Romans had attacked. I think it was an ambush, but they slaughtered every last one of them. So then, under I think it was Tiberius, this is where Germanicus made his name. He went and got even. Did the same thing to the Germans, to Germanic tribes. This is how they operated. You did not let a wrong go unpunished. It's just
So
how
is
it
that
is.
what the word overcome means? If you're, I'm not understanding exactly what that means. Feeling hurt by it, or giving into it and doing it yourself, or
No, I think he means when somebody does you a wrong, your instinct is going to be to pay back evil for evil.
Okay.
And I'm telling you, no, you're not going to overcome that by returning evil. You're going to overcome that by returning good.
Okay.
It's very difficult.
The context of this seems to be about the way people treat each other.
Yeah.
Basically, it's like Jesus said, do unto others as you have to do unto others, unto you. You know, the world says, do unto others before they do to you. Where Jesus is saying, no, if you want respect, you treat people with respect, and you get respect back. So that's the same what he's saying right here. You know, if you treat people with evil, they're gonna treat you with evil. If you
Yeah.
treat them with good, they're gonna treat you with good.
Not necessarily.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's never a universal in this kind of thing, right? There's kind of general principles where you can find lots of exceptions, but as a general rule, if you treat people, I agree, if you treat people with respect and kindness and so forth, and tolerance and patience, it's very disarming for everyone out there when they see that, and you will generally get back the
Well,
same thing.
I think that might be where the grace of God kicks in, because if the good that you have is coming from the Lord, then it's not going to demand the same kind of love coming back that you're giving. Does that make sense?
That was in the Star Trek episode too, in case any of you were wondering. But
Because our expectations, I think, at least for me, is when you try to show love to someone, you kind of think that's going to mean something to them, but sometimes it doesn't.
yeah, no, it doesn't.
but
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's a delay. I mean,
But-
everybody, yeah. I mean, I've been too many times to count, ungrateful, in the face of kindness, treated it with opposite. But a lot of that is still in my head. It'll dictate now my behavior that I did that.
so when it speaks of, this overcoming evil and not vengeance is God's, that's talking about actual evil, like sex trafficking and that type of evil, killing people.
Well, let's go back to Paul's life and what he
as opposed
experienced.
to just having your feelings hurt because somebody slighted you.
So he on the second journey, he was kicked out, first and second journeys, he was kicked out of one synagogue after another.
Mhm.
That's just what we're told about how about the final result. But we know from other passages that what went with that was stoning and beating and all these other kinds of things. Now, how did he respond to that? As a model of what he wanted other people to do. Now, when it came to the law, he did insist on his rights twice. And he did humiliate the magistrates in Philippi when he made him personally escort him out of the city. But he's making a point there, so he did do that. But I mean, there were countless times when Paul was treated in an evil manner. And my hunch is he just let it go, and they knew it. So when he says overcome evil with good, he can hold himself up as an example for that. In our case, what are the wrongs you know, the trafficking thing, I was just talking about this issue with a friend of mine in California. She wasn't aware that trafficking was a big deal in Michigan. And more specifically, Mackinac Island. For those of you that didn't know. Yeah, and so it'll change, you know, these kind of things, these things that happen underneath. It's like Hollywood. You know, you watch these, they have a, you know, Hollywood has this public relations machine that presents a certain image of itself. None of it's true. And it didn't just get bad. It's not like the Hollywood people of today are worse than ever. All the way back to the beginning. It's awful. It's terrible. But they were really good at presenting it. They have a public relations machine that presents a certain image. Well, all these people got wronged. You know. Well, you want to nurse that. You want to keep that alive in your mind. If you get a chance to get even, you want to get even. It's just very difficult when you are personally wronged, which is what I think he's talking about here. When you're personally wrong, to ever get past it, depending on how bad the wrong is. You know, you get cheated on a business deal. I don't know. Whatever, pick something, and you get wronged. The instinct is getting even, revenge. Especially if you didn't have the law on if you're a slave, well, there's no recourse. And he's probably got them, he's writing to here. He's writing to these people that are at the bottom. They just have no recourse. He's telling them, look, not only can't you get retaliation, but you shouldn't want it. You overcome it by doing good, returning the good for the evil. He's just laying down given their situation and ours, he's laying down a new way of thinking about it for them. And he did not let an evil go unpunished in the Jewish or the Gentile world. In the Roman Empire. We still have them today. You know, there's an island off the coast of Japan. I forget which side controls it right now. It's disputed between China and Japan. It's just a little rock. They'll never let it go. Taiwan and China. China's never going to let that go. Taiwan is inconsequential as far as the landmass goes, but they're never going to let it go. I was sitting at a table. I may have told the story. I was sitting at a table. It was a weird moment. I was at a wedding. One of Chuck Gilbert's twins was getting married a couple of years ago. And I was sitting at a table with the guy who is the chief information officer, Jackson National Life, Fortune 500 company. And one of their employees, which means one of his employees, worked for Chuck. Shouldn't have mentioned names just now. Oh well. But he is a Muslim. So I'm sitting at this room and at this wedding, and it's a American white guy, Christian, and then a Hindu from India, and then a Muslim from Pakistan. So we had a Pakistani Muslim and an Indian Hindu sitting next to each other, and the one works for the other. And the subject of Pakistan and India came up. I don't remember why, but I said something, you know, just to kind of talk about it, like pretend, I guess, like I know something about how serious it is, and it doesn't have a solution. They haven't resolved it or something like that. The dispute between India and Pakistan about Pakistan, and the guy from Pakistan he didn't get agitated. He just was making the point, and they never will resolve it. He wasn't talking as an angry Pakistani. He was just saying, I think he was saying, you Americans don't understand. You think we can just, do you think people just can put these things aside, like Israel and Palestine? Just put aside your differences and come to some agreement. The world doesn't work like that. These wounds run deep and ancient, and they, you know, just the way the world is. So in the face of that, how do you practice this, non-retaliation, payback evil with good? I've never been wrong not that I can remember, so seriously that I can't, you got the high school bullies or something like that. But if I can't get over that now, then that's on me at this point. But other than that, I've been let off fairly scot-free as far as other people wronging me. But the other people can't say that. So how do you, how do you deal with that? That's what he's getting at here. If you can't do anything, if you can do something in retaliation and don't, that's a real credit. If you are able to retaliate with evil and you don't, that's a real credit. If you are not able to retaliate, you're so low in the social status that you're not able, this would be encouraging too. You can overcome evil with good. It's not something that they would naturally think about. The idea that you could overcome evil with good.
But if somebody does something illegal against you, you don't just say, oh, well, I'll forget it. They should be turned into the law and there should be a punishment.
That's the part that is respect what is right inside moment.
Maybe, because he's going to get into the governing institutions, that they're there in the next chapter, that they're there to get the vengeance, that God has appointed them to get the vengeance. So if your house is robbed, that doesn't mean you just necessarily, there are laws on the books ordained by God, according to him in chapter 14, that you have recourse to. So don't do it yourself.
So if someone breaks in my house and I'm standing there, I just say, come on in, take what you want.
Well, now we're into the the issue of self-defense.
Yeah.
It gets very complicated once you get down to those issues. But if I'm standing in the house and he just wants my stuff, I'm not gonna shoot him. I'm not gonna shoot somebody over stuff.
And that's why people can loot stores. Because there's nobody at the door to stop them and they just let them carry the merchandise out.
We'll go one last level up as far as the now epidemic looting of department stores.
Mhm.
The message has been, when you have a morality, when your moral framework, when the world's moral framework has devolved to license, and you've decided that it is, how shall I say this, socially unjust to arrest people, you now by definition have given a mandate to people to act with moral license. Don't be surprised if they do. But the world was never intended to be that way, right? There is basic right and wrong, and the laws are supposed to reflect that. And those laws are there for a reason. But now when the state, which is what I blame, when the state abdicates its responsibility to its own citizens to provide for safety and so forth, then this is the world you get. You get a world of moral license. And that now is manifesting as basically the plundering of department stores all over the country. There, I successfully kept it to the moral and out of the political realm. After I turn off the feed, I'll rant politically, but I'm not going to do it on the. You've all heard the rants, so it's not too bad. Okay, let's see if we can finish this off. I don't dare go another week on this. Be of the same mind. There's the word for thinking. He started with the mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now he's be of the same mind. In verse 16, do not be haughty in mind. There's the second one. Let's see. And then finally, do not be wise, haughty-minded in your own estimation. So 3 different times at the close here, he comes back to the mind and thinking right about yourself and in your relationship, your status, so to speak. This is status oriented, but your status towards other people. 3 times he uses the word for think or to think in this chapter, in verse 16. So it seems to me that do not be wise in your own estimation is a prerequisite for being of the same mind. He's already given the one example of that: rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. He doesn't say rejoice with those who rejoice if they're of the same social class or higher. Weep with those who weep if they're of the same social class or higher. But if they're of a lower social class, a slave or something, then you don't have to weep if they're weeping. Philippians 2 through 4, you've all seen this before. Would have been written 6 years later, 5 years later, maybe something like that. Famous passage. Oh, it's not the one I was thinking of. Any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit. What am I reading? Hold on a minute. Not that I have any problem with the New International Version, but doesn't sound right. Any encouragement in Christ, any consolation of love, there any fellowship of the Spirit, any affection and compassion, and make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, small s here, others might have the Spirit, intent on one purpose. I think that last phrase is critical to being of the same mind, undersold, to the detriment of many churches. You have to have a common purpose. You have to all be headed in the same direction. If you are not, you are in big trouble. We can talk about that sometime. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. There it is again, thinking with humility of mind. There it is again, regard one another as more important than yourselves. There's the reciprocity. Do not merely look out for your own interests, but also the interests of others. And then he holds up Christ as the example, who took the form of a slave, claimed no rights or status for himself, died on the cross, died in the most shameful way, as a dreg of society. And then, and only then, was he exalted, but he was exalted not because he took revenge, but because he left room for God, and God exalted him. He was exalted. God highly exalted him. He didn't exalt himself. God highly. That's a consistent theme throughout the New Testament. And everybody will eventually bow before him. You can do it now or you can do it later. It's up to you. That's what I think. Verse 17, back to these, I hate to use the word principle, but I guess I'll use it. Principle of non-retaliation. Respect for what is right in the sight of all men, as he hinting at authority, governing authorities, and what society thinks is right, or something, I don't know. But he uses the word respect regarding it, whatever it is he's talking about there, even though he doesn't explain it. I'm sure the people in Rome knew what he was talking about. The non-retaliation idea that Jesus told the story, discussed, was in Matthew chapter 5, in case anybody wants to go back and look at that. Paul simply repeating it. The source is so obvious probably that he doesn't feel he needs to even say what the source is. I don't think he very often says, as Jesus told us. Does he ever do that? I don't know if he ever does that. He just simply repeats something Jesus said, and everybody seems to know what he's talking about.
Can we back up to verse 16 and talk about associate with the lowly? So is that about the class system?
That's what I think. We would tend to associate that with the poor. Associate with the poor, but go for the person. Go for the person. How about the phrase person of humble estate? How about that? Look what you did to me, Vic. I'm blaming Vic. Vic asked a question. I'm going to make him pay. I'm just kind of curious. I think it's like a humble estate idea. Of humble status. I don't know. Where was that? 16, associated with the lowly. Humble. Yeah, humble. It's just humble. It's just the humble, which I think means people that society may not value so much. Associate with them, something like that. I don't know.
That's another example of superseding the class system that they've.
I think so. I mean, I could be trying to fit it too systematically into the way that I'm thinking, But if you're going to translate it into our times, he means something more than go associate with the poor. He means associate with people you do not like to associate with, because you might very well like to associate with that really nice, funny poor guy. And you may not want to hang around that haughty, arrogant, rich guy. So you might prefer to hang around with, you might pat yourself on the back. Oh, look at me, I'm associating with a poor guy. No, it's talking about the ones that you wouldn't necessarily naturally cling to, so to speak. I think that's what he's getting at. So fill in the blank on that yourself. Yep.
He put himself in a place where better than anybody else, even though he was God. He still knows the time that he was the people that didn't like him. And he still did his thing to go to life. So, and he didn't distinguish between any class.
He separated himself from no one.
That's the policy.
Right. Yeah, and in Peter's case, on the most important point, the Jew-Gentile division, he was having none of that. He doesn't have any of it. He wants nothing to do with it when it's in the church in Corinth. He goes on and on about how they're separating themselves. But yeah, I just, we tend to want to be able to interpret the word. We'll tend to want to interpret a word like lowly. If I replace it with a person of humble estate, humble means, or it's not a lot better, because what's not brought into it is a person that the world may frown on me for associating with. Right? If I'm a Roman, there's other Romans in the room, and they see me associating with a slave, practically treating him like an equal. That's just not going to fly. It's hard to come up with that in our world. But there are people that we naturally want us to, kinds of people that we want to stay away from, that we do not want to associate with. That's the trigger, probably right there. Okay, well, that's a problem for me. That's my failing.
If we heed the things that are being said here, it's really, that helps us to really be blessed.
Yeah. Got to figure out how to do it. And find people to practice on, so to speak. I don't know how else to say that. Deuteronomy 32:35 is where we see the Lord will vindicate his people even in the midst of their, this is interesting. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. If you go back and look at that, we're not going to do it now because we're running out of time. But Deuteronomy 32:35, that is said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, in the midst of a rant, a divine rant by God against his own people for their rebellion. And in the midst of that, he's talking about, a quote, the Lord will vindicate his people even in the midst of their rebellion. So it's an interesting thing that even in their rebelliousness, he will take responsibility for vindicating them. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. He gives you a few examples here. He's thirsty, give him a drink. Proverbs chapter 25, 21 through 22 contains the promise, the Lord will reward you. Nobody seems to know what he means by heap burning coals on his head. You will heap burning coals on his head. I don't know what to make of that either. Luke 6.
They're the ones to be changed, not you. If you treat them and not give revenge, they're gonna be ashamed, of treating you to people. I think that's really what it's saying.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
They said that. You, like, people carrying something around them. something like that in, they were giving them something. for their fire.
Huh, yeah. If it's not that, yeah. You just don't want it to turn into looking forward to them getting what they got coming, you know.
You know, like.
Exactly, yeah. Friend is a strong term. Do I really want this person as a friend? You know? Yeah. Yeah. Luke 6:27-30 is the non-retaliation idea. I say to you here, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Ouch. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Back to Linda's point. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. Whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Now he's being, in my view, a little bit hyperbolic to make the point. He's in classic sage, and not that's a Greek term, in classic rabbinical style to make the point. This is the point. Give to everyone who asks you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you would want them to treat you. So somebody wrongs me and I don't get even. I forgive that person or something, maybe with the awareness that I have done similar things to other people and they didn't seek vengeance on me, or I'll do it tomorrow. Boy, will that change the way you drive and somebody wrongs you on the road. I've done exactly that thing too many times to count, but suddenly when another person does it, it's intolerable. You know, it's a little petty on my example, but okay, I'm gonna go ahead, shut down. That's enough. We got finished it, so that's great. On to chapter 13, yeah. Oh, you're welcome.